Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Employee Handbooks, Do's and Don'ts, presented by our sponsor, Heffernan. We're so happy you can join us. My name is Deb Beto, and I will be your moderator today and be monitoring questions you may have during the session. Before we open up the session, let's review a couple of key items. All of the webinar materials we discuss can be found at the URL currently showing on your screen. I will be sharing this URL in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to write it down right now. If you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. If you have audio difficulties or a telephone line goes dead during the call, hang up and call back again to the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the chat box during the webinar. If you are using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for the options bar to appear, and then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, but we will try to work your questions or feedback into the presentation. If we can't get to your comment or question during the session, we will be online afterwards to respond, or we may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. You may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenters will be answering questions at the end. And lastly, we have a number of webinars upcoming covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan webinar website. In addition, we offer the mandatory Preventing Harassment training in English 3 times a year. With that, let's begin today's webinar, Employee Handbooks, Do's and Don'ts. Today's interactive session will be facilitated by C.J. Westrick. C.J. Westrick is an SPHR and has been in human resources management for over 25 years and has worked in companies with 25 to 1,750 employees nationwide. C.J. received her SPHR, which is a senior professional in human resources, her national certification in 2002, and has a bachelor's degree in business management. She started HR Jungle in 2006 and targets companies who want senior-level HR expertise on a part-time basis. HR Jungle provides business owners and management teams workable solutions and hands-on assistance with employees and legal compliance through outsourced HR services. CJ, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Let's move into our objectives for today. Obviously, since this is on employee handbooks, we're going to be looking at various handbook policies. We're going to be talking a little bit about the location of employees. Some of you have remote employees, I'm sure, since that's become more and more popular every year. And then to talk about the documentation and training. I always like to start off with anything that I can find in the news related to the topic. And this one is about a vacuum manufacturer, and they terminated an employee on a medical leave for not calling in every day. But now they're having to pay the employee $50,000, and the EEOC is very good at throwing in some extras when they have these cases. So they also said that within 6 months, the company must prepare an employee handbook with its workplace policies on the consequences of not reporting into work daily, workplace discrimination and harassment, and how to request a reasonable accommodation for a disability. In addition, they have to do an all-employee meeting to explain these policies in the handbook, and the president or CEO of the company has to introduce a training session that will be for all employees on discrimination on the basis of disability and on retaliation. So you can see the EEOC is getting very hands-on and actually going beyond the money in lawsuits and working toward actual things that will change the environment of a company. We've got this one, which is fairly new, from Cheaters, which is apparently a TV show I've not seen. But the companies that produce it, that put it on, they're having to pay $50,000 to 2 female office assistants who were sexually harassed. they didn't have an employee handbook or a policy explaining the procedure for reporting inappropriate workplace conduct at the time that the complainants were working there. So for 2 years, they have to supplement their handbook to include an alternate avenue for making complaints where an employee is uncomfortable reporting through the internal process. They must provide an annual anti-sexual harassment training to all employees, including their managers, and they need to post a notice of non-discrimination on the employee bulletin boards, and they have to notify the EEOC each time they receive a complaint of sexual harassment from one of their employees. So the EEOC is going to keep a very close eye on this company, or the companies. It really is more than one company. I think there were 2. And in Texas, they don't have quite as many employment laws as we do. I'm in California. In California, we've been this year having to do sexual harassment training for all employees, which was new for us. We were only doing managers before. So do I have any others? Nope, that was the last one. So we're going to move right into the polling questions.
Sorry, I get myself on mute. Let me launch our first polling question here. Do you have an employee handbook on written policies? So have you answer this polling question, and encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. I'll be monitoring the questions and trying to work them into the presentation. So CJ, we have a good number of people voting. You guys are paying attention early on here. So we've got 86% say they do have an employee handbook. 7% says they have written policies, and the other 7% says that there's nothing in writing. CJ, I think you might be muted. CJ? Looks like we lost.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There she is. Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry. Push the button too hard, I think. So for those of you without anything in writing, hopefully you're not in California, because there are a couple policies here that must be in writing. The rest of you, I'm glad to see so many are using employee handbooks, but hopefully you're also looking at them and auditing them on an annual basis to make sure they're current. The written policies, although there are some things that can certainly be done as individual policies, if you start getting more than a couple, I would strongly recommend you move toward an employee handbook, simply because it's harder to track who's got which policy when they're a bunch of separate documents. So when we look at what's in a handbook, to me, it serves 2 purposes for my clients. One is it's a reference for the employees to look up. It's not going to include every detail, but it's going to be a reference point of like, oh, ask about this or ask about that, or here's some of our basic policies that we've got when you want a leave of absence or need one. Here's how you might qualify. Different things like that for behavior, what they're expected to do with their time cards, all different things like that. And for me and my clients, I have to say it's also an educational guide for them, for managers and above, to be cognizant of what the employment laws are for your state. Because I find a lot of people have started businesses that may not have had any experience inside, we'll call it a regular company or corporation, where there were the HR departments and the marketing departments and all the different pieces of a typical company. And so you'll find that some companies don't have those pieces, and so those owners never really were exposed to all the employment laws that you might have in your area, because we do have federal laws, and then some states, most states in fact, have some type of state laws. I don't have clients put operational details in there. It may not be a step-by-step like an SOP, standard operating procedure, for like how they're going to get an expense reimbursement paid out. What I will have in the handbook is something that instead says you need to submit any expense reports by such and such a date to this person or office. Same with the travel policy. If it's an extensive policy, then I think it becomes its own thing, a living thing. But some people, it depends. If you have a lot of travel in your company, then maybe it does. And a lot of times what we'll have in a travel policy is that if there's corporate accounts, like you're using Hertz or Avis or Budget as a corporation, and so you get better rates, so you want to direct your employees that are traveling to that particular agency. And also if you have, some kind of things like that. But as far as on the administrative side on how you're processing all that, then you might have a separate operational handbook for details, with like instructions on what the supervisor does with a time off request. Whereas the handbook perhaps only said, here's how to request the time off and what form you use and to give it to your supervisor or your HR department. Excuse me. And so you have to kind of look at that and see whether what you're adding to the handbook makes it into this big monster document, or if it is more, the kind of the simple leading the employees to go to the right direction. And I have seen, operation manuals. I've got a client, and it's funny because they have yoga studios. So usually you wouldn't think of them of having a lot of processes, but they have quite a few. And they developed, an SOP manual that exactly says, here's exactly how we're going to process a time off request. Here's exactly how, if you need time off, you do this and that. And they go through the details. Now, they also have an employee handbook that in briefer form, but they wanted something, it's like this is always business managers or people, business consultants will tell companies to get everything documented. I think the most useful that a detailed manual like this is at your front desk. If you have a receptionist or someone who's in the first person people are going to stop by when they walk in the company, I think that particular role needs to have a lot of detail, and they're going to have something that's more of a, front manual so that someone else could fill in when they take time off, because often people that do one-off jobs that nobody else knows about, you need something that helps those people fill in, even if it's a temp. But you need to kind of recognize how to divide what goes into an operations or, supervisor manual versus what needs to be in the handbook, employee handbook. But I do mention the other handbooks if they have them. So next polling question.
All right, so let me launch our polling question. Have you trained managers on your harassment policy? It's either yes, no, or we don't have a policy. And CJ, while they're answering that question, one of our audience members heard that there is an update on social media policy laws. Are you going to be addressing that in your session today?
I don't go that deep into the individual policies, so probably not.
Okay. Do you know about the new update on the social media laws?
I haven't heard anything particularly new lately, so maybe when we get toward something like that, or if they want to give me more information about it, I might have heard it and just I'm not thinking of it in that way.
Right, exactly. Okay, so our poll, we have 70% say yes, 22% say no, and 8% don't have a policy.
All right. The training is important because you need a couple policies. I know in California it's now a law that you have to have a written harassment policy. And there are other states, I believe, because of the whole Me Too thing that's been happening, or happened a couple of years ago out there, that there are more and more states developing harassment policies. And so you want to make sure that you've got something, but it doesn't do much good to have just the written policy if your management people aren't trained with it. So even those of you who don't have the policy, give some thought to what kind of training your managers need to make sure that they're not taking their thoughts and making it non-compliant for the company. I actually just got a call yesterday from a client who one of their managers in one of their locations, turns out that he's altering their time cards. He's telling people they can't use sick time without a doctor's note. And there was something else that they said he was doing. But these are in California against the law. And so the manager, has to be responsible for telling the employees and acting in a way that's within the law for your company and your location. But if your managers are never trained on what your policies are, written or otherwise, then they're going to be doing whatever they've done in previous companies. which is never a good thing, because even if it's a different size company, it may mean that there were different laws there. So you really need to understand that. When you're talking something like an harassment policy, it needs to explain what is harassment, what does constitute that. But even more so in a written policy, it needs to talk about inappropriate behavior, because most companies want their written policy to say inappropriate behavior is not allowed here, because you can control it that way before it truly turns into illegal. And you want to look at things like, have you promised an immediate, investigation versus timely or prompt? Immediate is going to actually make some employees think, really, the second they stop talking to you, you have turned around and started investigating. And often an investigation can't start that quickly. You have to find the appropriate investigator, a lot of little parts to that. You definitely want to start it very quickly, but you're not going to be able to promise and hold up to immediate. You have to know that your managers know what to do and say, because in some states, they might have personal liability for what they do when it comes to harassment. And you need to, as that one case I mentioned to you, you need to make sure the employees truly understand how they can make a claim. Who are their contacts, possible contacts? Are there verbal and written options for them? It's like we have usually relied on a written something from the employee, but court cases have been saying that now you can't force them to do a written. You might have to take a verbal thing and you write it down. So there's different things like that that you want to be very clear on in your policy and then in your training that follows up the policy. Do you have a drug and alcohol policy? Nowadays, with marijuana laws changing rapidly out there, you need to look at that. Does your policy say it's zero tolerance? And is that really the truth? Do you have company parties where there is alcohol served? Then that means it's not zero tolerance. So in those cases, you should have like a exception written into your policy that talks about, well, okay, with the approval of the CEO, there may be alcohol allowed at events or something, company-sponsored events, something like that. Do you mention that prescription drugs have potential safety issues? If they're on a drug that, even a prescription drug that says you shouldn't be operating equipment or even driving while on this, they should let you know that they're on something that could relate that. They don't have to tell you the details about what it is, as long as you know that it's a prescription drug and that they're taking it appropriately under doctor's care and it's going to be short term. You need to address marijuana these days. Is it allowed? I mean, the laws are changing so fast out there. I think it's New York City now that won't allow you to test or use marijuana as a basis for pre-employment testing. And I know I've had more than one client have issues with CBD, which is a derivative of the THC that's in marijuana. And it turns out that, like CBD, if it's a high quality, well, created oil, and they're taking it as recommended, it's not going to show up on a drug screen, but a lot of them are, because people are using the less expensive versions and perhaps taking it more often than the recommended dosage, and so then it starts popping as positive on a drug screen. Do you have it laid out for your testing? What are the reasons that you can test? What happens, exactly what happens if they test positive? So these are important things that companies are having to deal with, and I don't care what size you are. It's coming in all different states, in a lot of different varieties. And so you need to be clear on what that policy is, the company. If you're creating a policy after an event, it's very hard not to make it look like it's discriminatory, because now you're doing it based on this one person's behavior. So it's better to sit down with management and decide what these policies are. And if nothing else, even if you don't have a handbook, you put it in writing and you keep it in a file with a date on it that says, well, we did talk about this in February and here's our policy. It wasn't maybe public announced throughout the company, but we do have one that we're in agreement with. So you look at things like that. Let's go to our next polling question.
All right. Do you have a policy stating employees have no expectation of privacy? And CG, while they're answering that, we've had a few questions that come in. I'll go just to one or two of them. If you have union employees that are under a collective bargaining agreement, which takes priority in court, the employee handbook or the collective bargaining agreement?
Usually the collective bargaining agreement is going to outweigh the handbook. So if you have a union, I would say in your handbook, I've done handbooks for unions before, and throughout I'm kind of making a comment in there if I know it's covered under the union contract. Please refer to your union contract for this particular thing, and the rest of the handbook, or even that policy is directed to those employees not in the union, because not every single employee is going to be in a union.
Yeah, is it really possible to create one policy handbook for the entire company when some employees are covered by union and some are not?
Yeah, it is. If you make, references to the union contracts. I usually, in the introduction of the handbook, will put in, this company is, covered, or whatever the language is, for, these unions. And then if, look at the union contract and see what it says. I have seen some that literally mention nothing that I put in a handbook. And it's like, I'm not even sure why those people are in a union.
All right. So on our polling question, 31% said yes, they do have a policy stating that employees have no expectation of privacy, and 69% say no.
I would keep it in there. I put it in every single handbook and have for a very long time. Part of that is because, we keep changing. The laws keep changing. Technology keeps changing. And so that's like big and bold. You just can't expect privacy. I mean, yes, obviously in the restrooms, you're going to have privacy, but offices, now there's a lot of places that have shared spaces. And, and I have several clients who have cameras in we'll call them more public spaces, or over like a cube area and stuff like that. And but it also goes beyond that to where if you want them to understand that there's no privacy, that the company has the right to look at their emails, to listen to their phone calls, to check everything that they've done on their computers. And and so I've got that in there in places. I've got it in there in the electronic section about the emails and whatnot, but I also put it in there just in general, that you shouldn't expect privacy here, that the company controls everything you're doing. And because there have been lawsuits about where perhaps somebody was changing their clothes in their office because they felt it was private, and it turned out that office had cameras in it. Now, I do also put in there like GPS and video clauses in my handbooks, that if I know that there is video, I'm going to put it in the handbook saying that the, certain areas of the company, and I'll list them in general, office spaces, hallways, kitchen area, things like that, that might be covered by cameras. And then also with GPS. And I've even in a couple of handbooks, because I've had where employees were working like at a hospital or something, and we knew that their parking lots had cameras. And so I put that in the handbook to make sure that, okay, this employee has to recognize that there are out there. I've had clients call me because of what a camera picked up after hours, because one of their IT companies that they were using on their software or on their computer systems worked, it was an outsourced company, and they were coming in at night to work on somebody's thing, and let's just say they were doing things they shouldn't be doing in that person's office, and it was caught on camera. It's a lot of ways that people can be caught like that, and once you have the information that they've been seen, you have to do something about it. So it really pays to make sure everybody knows what is going on out there and what the options are. They may forget about the cameras, but once you've notified them, then at least they can't come back and say, oh, it was infringement on my privacy. And, so you want to kind of give that some thought. It's like your online activity, you can't be too rigid. There's, I'm not sure which new law or something like that was recently covered in what state it might have been for, but there's been a lot of activity. I mean, social media, people are out there posting every moment of their lives, it seems like, on social media. And, you have to be very careful about that. I often get clients that will contact me because an employee has put on their social media, it's like, I hate my supervisors, I hate my, it's like, I hate the company, I wish they would all die. And, and I've talked to attorneys about this, and they have told me that there's really nothing the company can do, because they're posting an opinion and other employees are linked to them, and therefore it's it's legal, is all I can say. It's like it falls into that concerted activity that the National Labor Relations Board had put into place at one time. And so you have to, make sure the things you can protect is that they're not being destructive with your company name. They're not using your logo or proprietary information improperly, things like that. But what they say out on usual social media, you can't control particularly. If you want to control it, make sure they're posting it on your own social media pages. I mean, the company pages, not, and because I've had clients that encourage their employees to post with clients and stuff, oh yeah, please contact the clients, keep them up on what we're doing and stuff, but they don't do it. They haven't set up, social media pages for their own company. And then they're objecting to what the employee is putting out there that's not directed to the clients or about the company. It's like, oh, look, he put, a picture of them, in a Speedo, and I don't want that. And it's like, but it's their own social media. You can't control that. So you need to make sure that you're, using and controlling the company pages and setting those up appropriately. The same with company cell phones or personal cell phones. If you are having an employee use their personal cell phone for company related things, you have opened yourself up to them owning, or having on their phone your entire client, contact list, things like that. So you need to consider what you're using for electronics and how it's being, in what way you can protect it, but to also put those rules then in the handbook, to where, it's like, to make sure they know that you've got GPS on all your company vehicles, that if you're using timekeeping apps, that it does have GPS at the clock in, when they're clocking in or clocking out, but it may or may not track them otherwise. Because if it does track them otherwise, you need to have a statement that tells them how they can turn it off. So there's a lot of little pieces in there that you have to think about, and it's easier to put it in the handbook so everybody has gotten the same message. So the next polling question.
All right, we're ready. What type of disciplinary procedure do you have? So we've had a couple of questions. I think there needs to be some clarification on what is an NLRB clause. I know it stands for National Labor Relations Board, but
okay, they came out a few years ago, basically saying if two employees are slamming the company, they just shared opinion, and they called it, that it's labeled concerted activity. So the employees, it was kind of when the NLRB started expanding, it was like, my theory was that the unions were going downhill. There weren't as many of them. So the NLRB started looking for other ways that made them valuable. And they really, they were being over the top many times. I would see court decisions that would come in and saying, we feel that the NLRB really overstepped their boundaries, but they were only controlled by the president. So they had no governing body above them to say, slow it down, don't go in that direction. But they were really focused on handbooks for a long period of time there, that it was quite scary with some of the stuff they were coming up with and filing suit against. So it's your handbooks, I still keep in my handbooks, even though they seem to have changed a little bit. They're not coming out with things all the time. But, I still put in my handbook that, nothing that I'm saying, especially when it comes to social media, is meant to be in conflict with the NLRB's concerted activity policies.
Okay, and just real quick, yes or no question on privacy. Can you use GPS in California on company vehicles?
Yes.
Okay.
I still like to
on our poll,
the employee knows, but yes.
Okay, excellent. So on our polling question, what type of disciplinary procedure do you have? 23% say discretionary, 49% say progressive, and 28% don't know the difference.
All right. So let me explain the difference to start with. Discretionary, well, okay, progressive is, sorry, I call it old school, because this is the type of disciplinary programs that had been around for forever. Let's just say 50 years ago, they were doing the progressive. That means that, all right, when somebody screws up, they get warning number 1. When they screw up again, they get warning number 2. And there's a laid out plan. It's in the handbooks. It says, okay, here's what you get for the first, problem. Here's what you get for the second problem. Here's what you get for the third. When you get, I worked with a company that did this. It's like, when you get 6, you will be suspended or you will have this happen to you. Very rigid and laid out. If you have that kind of progressive, you might as well put it in your handbook, because you are held by law to follow that order no matter what they've done. If it's, if it's laid out that, first, disciplinary event, whatever it is, this is the pattern it always will follow. I prefer discretionary, because discretionary means you can choose anytime someone screws up what you're going to do with them. I have seen screw-ups that have cost the company a lot of money, and they considered it a terminable offense. So this was no warning 1, 2, and 3 here. They fired the person. I have seen people who got immediately a final warning, a one-time shot. It happened in a company I was in, because we had we had $15,000 worth of biotech stuff, we'll call it, that needed to be refrigerated. It came in refrigerated. It needed to go into the big refrigerator we had out in the warehouse. Somebody forgot to do it. Well, we know who did it, who forgot. It sat out there and went bad. So it cost the company $15,000 because of that little oversight. That, to me, I think goes a little bit beyond writing number 1, write up number 2. So for me, discretionary, I like to have, because there are just some things that need to be seriously dealt with right away, rather than just a slap on the hand 5 or 6 times before you really do something about them. But I do know there's a lot of companies, and this came, I think, primarily the most is in manufacturing industries, to where they've got a lot of hourly people, and it's just that they followed we'll call it the old school method of doing this. And if it works, that's fine. For my clients and the way I do, discipline stuff, I prefer the discretionary. I want the company to have the ability to treat it, in a more equal ground based on what the event was. I do use, if there's a disciplinary policy where maybe you have your code of conduct, I put in there, it includes these things that are listed below, but it's not limited to just those things. You want to give yourself some wiggle room in there. Also, if I'm doing write-ups, it's like violations, or I put it in the handbook too, violations may lead to disciplinary action up to and including termination. Now, even on the progressive, you can still have that in your policy, but that's probably not going to, because that is what you're leading to if they continue the bad behavior or irresponsible behavior or whatever they're doing. You want to make sure that you've got time off policies in the handbooks. You don't want to include something like FMLA, the Federal Medical Leave Act, if you have less, if you're not subject to it, if you have under 50 employees. I've seen companies pull in handbooks from their previous employer. It's like, oh, I've got a copy of the one that we used in my last company. Why don't we just update that with our name and use that? There's a very good reason why you don't want to do that, or that you don't want to just pull it off the internet. It's because most employment laws are based on employee size, how many employees you have. And so if you're using one that doesn't fit the size of your company or your location, then you don't have one that's going to be compliant. And that's worse, almost worse than having one that's just not been updated lately. So keep that in mind. If you put it in the handbook, you're going to be subject to it. You've made yourself subject, even if legally you weren't. And I saw a company of 5 employees that did this, just that. They pulled in their old handbook, had an FMLA policy in there, and so that made them subject to this with 5 employees instead of waiting until they were larger. Your various time off policies. This is one I think is very important to have in the handbook, or if you don't have the handbook, as a separate policy, because this is one that people, the employees look up frequently. They want to know about any paid time off or unpaid time off, what qualifies. There's a lot of paid sick leave going on now. I mean, California alone, we've got a state policy. There are 30 localities at last count that have a different law for their city. And it's always going to be higher than the state, but there's a lot of other states I've been seeing come up where now they're having, they're doing paid sick leave. So make sure that you know what's legal and required in your state, and that your managers know that, and you know how to deal with it, what the rules are with these sick laws, because the ones in California weren't particularly written well, and so it's a little bit confusing for a lot of my clients. So you need to understand, what it is. Vacation, how are they earning it, and, when can they use it? How much advance notice do they need to give you when they want the time off? Personal holidays. Personal holidays used to be added to vacation. It was like, all right, we've got our sick time, we've got our vacation time, and we're going to also give employees 2 personal holidays a year that they can use at their discretion. Well, in California, we can't use those anymore because court case came up and said, gosh, they get to pick when they use them. They can't be use it or lose it. You have to pay them out if they don't use it. And so we stopped using them and just changed vacation. If we want to give them more time, you can use them if, if you said you can have your birthday off and you need to take it sometime within 2 weeks around your birthday, something like that. But again, make sure you know what your state is requiring and how it needs to be written to meet those guidelines. Do you have a probationary period, or, it's that first 90 days when someone's hired? Do you have something like that? And what do you understand what legally that gives you or doesn't give you? Do you have in there, it's like I usually put in handbooks because most of my clients have some type of onboarding period, to where it's like, all right, we're going to be checking each other out during this period. And, to put in there, it's like, this is for the employee and for the company to be looking at each other. You can't figure everything out in an interview. So you want to be clear about it. This is in there. We may find, ours is normally 90 days, but we may extend it, at our discretion. If you don't follow up at the end of that 90 days and kind of give the employee some definite, great, you've survived that period, now you're a regular employee. If you're not actually following up, don't say you're going to. You need to make sure that the handbook always matches your actions, or vice versa, that it doesn't do any good to put all this little compliant language in a handbook and you're not doing any of it, because what you do is going to always weigh heavier in court than what you wrote. So you need to make sure, and that's kind of your annual sanity check. Are we still doing everything we've said we're going to do in the handbook? Did we change something and forgot to change the handbook? Next polling question. All
right, let's launch that polling question. There's a lot of questions coming in all of a sudden. Does your handbook explain when they are paid? So I'm going to go back to a couple of questions that came in previously. Are you required to give the handbook in the employee's preferred language, such as Spanish or Farsi or any other type of language?
You're not legally required to, and I've talked to attorneys about this because I had one client where a lot of their employees, most of their employees were Hispanic and some only spoke Spanish. Some couldn't even read Spanish. I've had clients where they couldn't even read Spanish. And he said, it's like, well, obviously if you want to protect the company, it's nice to at least have the majority language, it translated into that so that you can make sure, because I know with unemployment and, claims and stuff, it's hard to discipline someone for not following your policy if they couldn't read what it was. So if they, you don't have to translate it, but make it available in some other way to where maybe, I've got one client where he doesn't even hand them out. It's like he's got one at the front desk and says you can borrow it, and he lets them borrow it like on a library system. You can check it out, take it home, have somebody read it to you, and bring it back. So you need to find ways to make sure that employees are able to understand your policies, because it makes life easier all the way around.
Okay. So on our poll, does your handbook explain when they are paid? 79% say yes, 12% say no, and the rest are not sure.
All right. Obviously, aside from paid time off, employee, their paychecks are very important. And so that's something you want to have clearly spelled out. Don't, I know at least in California, and I'm guessing probably in many other states, you have to provide that paycheck on the day you've told them you're going to. Like if you're doing, every other, if you're doing a biweekly, that means every other Friday you will receive your check. And it's going to pay for the 2 weeks previous, not the week they got the check, the 2 weeks previous. You want to be very clear. You also need to make sure that it's talking about, because like in a lot of them that aren't doing it like that, if they're doing a weekly, if they're doing a biweekly, you're always going to have a pretty easy time of it. However, holidays pop up here and there. So you need to have in the handbook what happens when a holiday is on the date they were going to get paid. In California, you can choose that they will always get paid the day before, the work day before, or the work day after. But you have to follow the thing. You have to say, this is what we do, and then you have to do it. I have seen companies that are, we'll just say, flexible with their pay date. And it's like, no, their pay period as far as what the pay period is the period of time the employee works that they're getting paid for. The pay date is the date the check comes out. And so that pay date is supposed to be locked in. This is why they're there. You want to be very clear. In the handbook, you want to take it a step further and talk about overtime. What works? California is the only state that has the 8-hour workday. We have to pay overtime on anything over 8 hours in a day or over 40 regular hours in a week. So ours is a more complicated thing. We've got calculations for everything here. But in other states, fortunately, they've got just 40 hours. Anything over 40 hours in that week counts as overtime. But have you explained what your work week is? What 7-day period are you considering that time frame that you're looking at your 40 hours? And I've got clients that actually have a work day that maybe starts at 4 a.m. and ends at 3:59 the next day. And they do that because they have a night shift, or a swing shift. Same with a work week. If I've got clients with a lot of people working on weekends, then maybe we're going to start the work week on the weekend so that you can let them off earlier, in the regular week if they are moving toward overtime. But you need to look at that. It's nothing in stone that says that you have to do like a Monday through Sunday or a 12, a midnight to 11:59 type of work day, but you need to spell it out so everybody is understanding. And what happens, how the overtime is calculated, whether or not it needs pre-approval. These are things that often people get disciplined for, so you need to have it be clear so that they know what they're being disciplined about, and to look at things. There was a court case a while back about de minimis time. And in California, we ended up with a different decision than the federal decision, unfortunately, but we're in California. We do everything differently here. So you need to look at things like grace periods. There is such a thing as a grace period where employees can clock in up to 10 minutes before they're supposed to start, 10 minutes after they're ending their work, but they're not supposed to actually work. It's more like they're collecting themselves. They're gone, they're getting their coffee, they're whatever, but they're not actually starting to work then. That's a great, grace period, but you need to have that written very clearly in a handbook if you use that. Rounding has gone through a lot of different lawsuits, and and so you need to know in your state what is allowed. I know in California we can use quarter of an hour actually, but I think that's a little bit much sometimes. But if there's a good reason for it, sometimes it's easier to use the 1/10 of an hour because that's every 6 minutes. And but again, you want to have that laid out very clearly as to what is expected. Off the clock work. This has been lawsuits in the last year that we've seen, and where the de minimis time came in. So this came up from, I don't think it was Starbucks, even though Starbucks gets hit a lot. I'm not sure if this was or not, but it was something similar to that, where they had like the supervisor that when they were closing, everyone had to leave. He had to close down the register. He had to go in back and clock out and then come out, lock and pull down the gate over the front door. And he filed a lawsuit that over a year and a half, I think he felt he was owed, it was like $15. No, it was $103, something like that. Anyhow, but he filed a lawsuit, and that's what caused both federal and then California. Federal came in and said, all right, we consider that where it's an odd minute here or there as de minimis time. and it doesn't need to be paid. California looked at it and said, gosh, based on our laws, it does need to be paid. So again, you want to have that very clearly laid out. I've changed handbooks since that, even before that really, because we were having issues, to said, you know, if you've got a supervisor who sends emails or text messages to an employee after hours, that is paid time. It should be paid time, or at least thought about. You know, how much is happening when the person's not clocked in? And do you need to do something about it? Meal and rest breaks. Know your state laws. California, again, is very, very picky. We have exactly how much time they're supposed to take, when they're supposed to take it, and it needs to be laid out very cleanly in the handbook, because this is, in California, the _1 thing companies get sued about, or at least it gets added on to nearly every lawsuit that's out there. So in your state, do you have any laws? You know, do you say what is doing, you know, what's going on? Do you allow rest breaks? Do you allow, which OSHA is providing now, is cool down breaks? Is that in your handbook? So if you've got people that are working in, you know, outside or in a hot warehouse that's not air conditioned, OSHA now has rules about, you know, okay, if they feel hot, they have the legal right to go sit down somewhere in shade with water on a chair for 5 minutes, and they can take as many of these cool down breaks as necessary. So do you have something like that in your handbooks based on what company, you know, what your company is? Free speech. In California, we cannot prevent employees from talking about their wages, and as much as many companies would like to. We already talked a little bit about unions. You know, is there, you know, something you need to mention about that? Do you have some kind of terms and conditions? Void terms and conditions of employment, but have you laid that out in writing somewhere? Again, you know, do you have a policy that says if they have a complaint, even if it's not an harassment complaint, do you have something that says, here's what you should do with this complaint if you have an idea or something's going wrong that you think, you know, needs to be corrected? But you really do want to make yourself open to listening to employees in some fashion, and putting it in writing helps them understand it, because a lot of times people are somewhat shy about bringing up things. Even in small companies, you know, I work as an HR consultant, and I have found in a small, you know, smaller company, we'll say under 10 employees, where maybe there's no one other than the owner in management. And I've had employees tell me, well, you know, it's like I have questions about things, but I'm afraid to, you know, we've got a great relationship with our owner, and I don't want to bring it up to him in case he like thinks badly of me, or, you know, or it turns out it's something, you know, legal, and I just need to know that. You know, and so sometimes, you know, with my clients, some of them use me as what we call the safety net, to where when an employee is not comfortable talking to someone in the company, you've given them an outside resource that's not an attorney to ask about this stuff. Think about these kind of things, and, you know, and mention it in the handbook if you have these resources. Leaves of absence, another big one for employees. They want to know when they can take time off, what legally entitles them to it. And most likely, I mean, I put a lot of stuff, California's got a lot of different leaves, and I put it all in the handbooks. And I do that as much for the employee as I do for the company, because a lot of times people put into supervisory or management positions without really good training. And so they may not know what is allowed. And I want to put it in there so at least it's a heads up to them that, wow, these are legally, you know, offered leaves that might be part of that. And in my leaves, I have a section that starts off all my individual leaves that says, here's about your leave. I talk about how long we're going to cover them for insurance, you know, and what the rules are for them making any copays they might need to make. I put in there what we want them to do as far as talking with the company. We don't expect people to call us every day, but every couple of weeks, especially if they're out on a medical, to give us a heads up on what's happening with them. You know, what are you doing with company property while they're on the leave? I have now changed my handbooks to say, when you're ready to go on leave, you will turn in all company property. Because, and I do this for two reasons. One is, and what started originally was because when we've had a leave go on really long, we, you know, and later we find, okay, we really do need to get someone to fill that spot temporarily. And so then if halfway through their leave we ask for the property back, they think they've been terminated. It's like, no, 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 we just need to use the equipment. So now that's how I position it. The company may need to, we may need to have someone else fill in for you and use your equipment, so we need to have it here. I've gotten into the point of even diverting their emails. Now, recognize that you're on a leave of absence. That means there is no work. We will have your email sent over to this person. They will be responding while you're gone. And then what is the rule for when they return to work? Do they need a note from their doctor, or do they need something else? How much notice do you need to give them? They need to give you, that kind of thing. Look at all that kind of stuff. And, because these are things that something, especially like the insurance, I've had an attorney tell me that there is no law that says how long, unless California has one law for pregnancy leave that specifies how long we have to keep the insurance running. But there isn't anything else out there that says that. And so an attorney told me that in this case, your handbook rules. If I've put in there that we will only keep your insurance going, before we offer COBRA for 30, 60, 90 days, then that's what we're doing. But if it's not in there, then it's going to take longer at some point to say, okay, you've been out for a long time. Now we're going to have to switch over there. But now that notice is going to have to go out like, at least 30 days before you're going to switch them over to COBRA, whereas it was easier to do it when it was up front before they ever went on a leave. Next polling question.
All right, let me get that going. Do you have off-site employees? While you're answering this polling question, I'll say that there's been a lot of questions that are coming in. We're probably going to have to follow up after the presentation with questions by email, unless people are able to stay on afterwards and listen to a few of the answers. But let's see if I can't get to one or two right here. Can you really use it or lose it if you're a non-union employee?
Use it or lose it. I'm guessing we're talking about like vacation.
Yeah, well, I think this question relates to both vacation and sick leave.
Okay. Sick leave in California, the way the California law was written, yes, it's either use it or lose it. Now, attorneys will argue it's like, no, 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 that's not what the law says. But from the employee side, that's what it looks like. If they're allowed, 40 hours or 24 hours or whatever you've got for the locality you're in, it's like if they haven't used it, they don't get paid out. It doesn't, it may roll over, but it's still going to have a max they can use every year. And if they don't, it just disappears. Now, on vacation, that's a different thing because that is really, truly earned wages is the way the courts think of it. So on the wages, at least in California, again, check your local, stuff. Normally, vacation, you can't do a use it or lose it anymore. You need to pay it out. So the way you kind of protect yourself a little bit is to put a cap on how much they can earn. When they hit the cap, it stops accruing, they stop earning it, because that word earn is critical when it comes to a lawsuit. So they're earning it while it's still accruing, but once you've hit a cap or something like that, then you have to pay it out or let it keep rolling over, and you can't just have it disappear in most places.
All right, so when it comes to our poll, do you have off-site employees? 66% say yes, and the rest all say no.
All right. When you think an offsite, give some thought to your people that work in the field. Most companies aren't necessarily thinking of these as off-site people per se. You do have some, there's a lot of companies out there now that actually have people working from home offices, stuff like that. But don't forget that you've got people, depending on your industry, you may have people that are out there. You've got your sales reps who are out there bouncing around all over. You've got people that are in construction that are out actually working on different job sites all the time. But to take a look at this and to think about your handbook when you do this, field employees need access to the required postings. It is legally required that they have access to the information that's on your wall poster, to some other stuff. So consider putting a poster addendum. You can get that poster information in PDF form. I mean, basically you're picking all those pieces off that thing, and each policy that's on, each law that's on that poster has a PDF out there somewhere. And then you have it. It turns into like 36 pages, believe me, I've done this. But you put it as an addendum. to the handbook. If you're having to print the handbook, and that makes it a little costly, so instead, you know, if you've got like especially when you've got people with job sites out there, what I've done is we put the posters in a separate little binder, and we told them they are behind, you know, there will always be this binder behind the truck that the supervisor's driving. Or if sometimes job sites have what they call the job box or something where they're keeping equipment and things in, you know, tools for the job, and they lock it up at night, keep it in there. And then let the employees know where it will be. I even have them sign off on a form saying, I know this is where I can find it. You know, so give that some thought to what you're doing to make sure that you're being compliant, that they have access to that information that's on that stuff. Dress codes. This one moves around all over the place, but give some thought. You know, we've recently in California had a law that says we can no longer discriminate based on hair in certain areas. So things now like the dreadlocks, the braids, you know, the things that people do for religious purposes with their hair. All this kind of stuff is now moving into that protected category in both New York and California that I know of so far. You know, looking at, you know, your dress code, don't separate it by men and women. It doesn't matter if you're saying a tank top, because it doesn't matter who's wearing it if you're not allowing it. It doesn't matter who's wearing the skirt. So don't break it down like that. Kind of say, you know, clothing, whether it's, if you're allowing shorts, it's like, you know, skirts and shorts have to be no shorter than 2 inches above the knee, whatever. But be consistent and look at that and make sure that you're not bumping against, you know, harassment laws or religious, you know, clothing or now these special protections that are out there. Also consider what you're doing about tattoos or piercing, whether or not you have anything that could qualify as uniform, which would be things with on it. Sometimes there's a full uniform, sometimes it's just the logoed shirt, and understand what the rules are for these things. Put a disclaimer in your handbook that it is a guideline. It's never going to be able to say, and you don't want it to say every little thing, because if you say too much in the handbook, then a court case is going to throw that out by saying, well, you put all of this other detail in here, so why isn't this in there? So you want to kind of give guide, you know, give them something to look toward, you know, okay, you know, you need to do this, but you're having things, it's not an employee contract. You know, these are the rules for working here, and that it can be revised at the company's discretion. I'm going to skip our last one just to save a little time here. Make sure you do review your handbook. Every year, it needs to be looked at. You may not have any changes because there's a lot of laws that come out that don't really affect the language of your handbook. You may need to know them. You might need to know that it changes a little bit about how you're going to deal with something. But, you know, look and see, have you gotten a lot of employee questions about different things that maybe would stop if you just clarified it a little bit more in the employee handbook? You know, have you looked to see, okay, are there new laws? But I think some of the bigger changes I see are on the company's practices and just policies that they're putting in place. Make sure it's readable. I have, you know, attorneys will give you a compliant handbook, but often it's got legalese in it, or it's written not in a friendly manner. You know, I mean, I actually have somewhere a copy of the original Disney handbook. It's got cartoons all throughout and stuff. It doesn't say a whole lot, but it's very fun to read. And I've got one client that actually has a handbook similar to that, where they've kind of changed their language based on their company name and what they do and stuff like that, to where it's got, you know, things in it and little pictures of, you know, they've got, you know, different kind of cutesy names for some of their teams of workers and things, and they use that throughout. You know, make it friendly, make it fun, but make it compliant. I've also seen an attorney written handbook where 21 pages were focused on proprietary information. And to me, that makes it not readable. Everybody's going to skim over that, so you haven't really served the purpose. It needs to be readable. People need to be able to understand it, or they won't follow it, and you're going to have a hard time having it back you up in court, which is one of the really good reasons that you have a well-written handbook, is that it can help you in court, or it can work against you if it's not written well, or doesn't explain things, or frankly, if you're just not following it. And when you distribute it, often when I have a handbook going out with a client, we come up with a bullet list. These are things that we want to cover. If it's a rewrite, like we're just updating it, then we'll put together a bullet list of like, here's the updates that we've done. So you might want to go in and double check on those policies again. But you want to, if it's a first time handbook and you're rolling it out, talk about the things that you know are really important to the company and to the employees. You know, in California, that's always going to be that meal and rest breaks. It's going to talk about overtime and the fact that you need to get pre-approval. It's going to be talking about the de minimis, you know, that off the hour, you know, off the clock type. It's going to talk about things like that that fit, that they're concerned with every day, your time off policies. The rest of it is legal stuff that you want in there, but you've got to focus on, you know, when you're talking to the employees, what is they interested in? What shows up most often in lawsuits out there. Every state, you probably have a list of like, here's the things that are most likely going to pop up. So you want to train on that. And we talked about translations. You know, I think it does pay to translate it. It's just not legally required at this time. And make sure they have signed off something you've got in their file. You go through your personal files, make sure everybody has a form that's signed off on that date's handbook. It needs to be the current one because it's the only way you can hold them to it. And I'll stop talking. So, questions?
All right. So if you are able to stay on for a few minutes while CJ answers some of the questions that came up, that's great. If not, I will get a record of the question that you asked and we can follow up by email afterwards. So CJ, is it mandatory to add the number of sick days in a policy?
I would, because you want to make sure people are following it. And I know that I've actually been told by an attorney that if you don't have a sick leave policy, at least in California, if you don't have a sick leave policy that specifies how much they can use each year, you can't limit the amount of time. It may be that it could run on like that. So some things need to be in writing.
Okay, and if a company has a pre-approved policy on overtime, are they mandated to pay if they work on their own overtime? So how do you protect yourself if the employee is just saying, hey, I just need to get this done, I'm not going to charge the company overtime?
You need to be very clear because that can always come back to bite you. So you tell the employee, it's like, no, you put it on the clock, or you tell the employee, no, finish it the next day. But if they do it on their own without telling you in advance they're going to, you do have to pay it, but then I would write them up for going against your policy.
Okay. And how does it work in California if employees, how does overtime work in California if employees work 4 10-hour days or 3 12-hour days?
You can do that, but you need to have an official alternate work week document set up. It's a process. And it's laid out in the Industrial Welfare Commission orders that we have in California. There's 17 versions of it, but they focus on different industries. And it includes having a proposal to the employees that will be affected by it. They do a secret ballot vote. If they pass it, then they sign an agreement, and then a letter goes to the state. And that's the official process for doing that. Otherwise, you're going to be paying overtime.
Okay. And on pay dates, what happens when the payroll service or the bank messes up and employees are not paid on time? That's totally out of the control of the business. What happens then?
As a rule, my experience has been, because I've had that happen with some, and I've not, I mean, usually I know I've had actually just this year 2 different payroll companies where they had some kind of weird power outage and they weren't able to process the payroll normally. And they, you know, because they have capabilities they don't tell you about, and they actually were able to process it and get it into the banks on time. And normally if you wanted them to do that, they'd charge you for it. But in this case, they were like, we will make sure it gets in there. Worst case scenario though, if they just tell you that it's not going to happen, you know, it's like they're going to recommend you write a live check for these people, because, you know, I know in California there's a penalty every day that you're late with that check. If the company does it and you get penalized, you know, if the payroll company does it and it truly is out of your hands, then, you know, you need to, I think, work it out. You might not have a penalty. I mean, nobody may report that or something like that. But I would say, you know, if that actually happens, because I've not seen it happen to where they couldn't get it in the bank in time. So I maybe would look at another payroll company if you have that happen often.
Okay. And you gave some examples about pregnancy and disability leave. Are the rules discretionary to the company, or are they mandatory?
No, they're pretty much mandatory. The pregnancy leave, there's certain language you want in there about like what qualifies, at what point you want doctor's notes. Excuse me. I mean, some of it, you know, like on a disability, because the pregnancy law is just an isolated disability leave, medical disability leave. But, you know, that one's got more rules because in California we have pregnancy law is the most protected thing out there now. The attorneys have all told me that now it has no loopholes whatsoever. So you want to be very clear on what you're expecting, what the employee can expect, stuff like that, exactly how much time they're allowed. For normal disability, if it's somebody just falls and breaks their leg and can't come in, you still want something that says, okay, you know, here's what we need. Because those medically related leaves are all based on the doctor's notes. Everything about them follows rules from the doctor's notes. So I'd say look and see what you legally need to be in there and then just make it readable. You know, because my pregnancy leave covers, well, probably a little over a page. You know, it's got some bullets in there. It's got some things about the lactation location, about baby bonding that's separate from the leave itself, because I want them to understand that baby bonding doesn't come with California's pregnancy leave. That's for the disability part, not for the baby bonding part. So you kind of want to be clear, you know, because those are the leaves that are used most often. So you want everybody to understand what it is.
Okay. And how do you compute FMLA? I know that there are rules on, you know, whether a company has to comply with FMLA based on how many employees it has. But how do you determine how many employees you have if you are, you know, maybe have a small number of people in your office, but then you have tons of, you know, staff members that are out at different facilities?
Well, the radius is within 75 miles. So the rule is, do you have 50 or more employees? It's 50 or more employees for 20 consecutive weeks of the previous or current year. And then it's whether or not they qualify even, because you're counting all your employees, everyone who's on your payroll. But when you count to whether or not they're actually eligible, you're looking at a radius of, are there, you know, 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius of where that employee works.
And then in that case, you have to include all of your employees, even the employees that are outside of that radius?
Yeah, it's when you're looking to see whether or not the company is subject to the law. Yes.
Yes. Okay. And in regards to paid time off, a company may have a policy where you don't use or use it or lose it, but can you have a cap on how much of accrued PTO can be paid out?
Yeah, if you're doing, like if you're doing a regular PTO and they're accruing throughout the year, the minimum cap is going to be 150% of their earning power for that year. So if they normally earn 2 weeks per year, the minimum cap has to be at 3 weeks. You can have higher. I have some that do the 200%, so they'll do 4 weeks. But the 150% is the one you want to look at. That's when you can cap it, and it'll make it through court. If you try and say they're going to cap it at 2 weeks because they earn 2 weeks a year, that will not fly in court. It has been turned down and says no, they need time to use the full amount they accrued.
Okay. And can you have separate policies for, let's say, office staff versus field staff, for example? Yes,
anything that you can put a strong line between. You can have it based on longevity of employment. So length of employment, you can say field versus office. You can say manager level and above versus non-manager levels. Anything that there's a very clean, distinct line to where nobody's going to question which side of that line they're on.
Mm-hmm. What about a different handbook for each department?
I wouldn't recommend that. I mean, I'd have to be told why they're even thinking about that, because the handbook is mostly company policies, not department policies. There, and I think it would get very messy, because within a company, somebody might transfer to a different department. I mean, if you're talking something like General Atomics, it's huge. Even they are going to have one basic handbook. And there might be, I've done a handbook where it had like an addendum for some special rules within a certain location, things like that. But there was still the basic handbook with all the normal general rules.
Okay. And, oh, I just lost the question. Hold on just one second. Is an electronic receipt of a handbook acceptable?
Yes, as long as you can truly show that it was that person who signed it. So it kind of depends. If it comes back, I mean, even an email where they've had to log into their emails to be able to say, yeah, I got it, can work. A lot of the electronic signatures we have out there, even though you can't actually read the signature, as long as you can have proof that it was this person who was the only one who could access it. Yes, so there's various ways you can do it.
All right, and 2 more questions. How long are we required to hold a position when an employee is on medical leave?
That's going to be, it depends kind of answer.
Yeah. That's a whole nother webinar.
Yeah, it's like a whole nother webinar. It's going to be dependent on a lot of different things. But one thing to keep in mind is that, I mean, usually if somebody's asking for a leave, let's call it a medical leave, and the doctor's note says that, all right, this person shouldn't be working for the next 2 weeks. And at that time, the doctor's going to meet with them again and either give you an extension or say they can come back to work. I usually will say, okay, for that period of time, if you've allowed the leave, as far as the employee is concerned, that job is protected. So that's where you want to be careful about your language and what you're doing. There are some leaves where it absolutely is protected, but there's others that maybe aren't. You've got that discretion. I usually say it's like, all right, if you've got a doctor's note that's only for 2 or 3 weeks, you're not going to replace them in that short of time. So leave that open. But if you get an extension and it is something you really need, then maybe you can talk about filling that position. But it is going to be very much depending on what's going on overall.
Okay, and our last question leads me to believe that maybe a webinar on payroll policies might be a really interesting webinar, because we've had a lot of payroll questions, and our last question is also a payroll question. Go ahead.
I was going to say, we weren't doing one, and I can't remember if it was one this year or not, because I know they removed one from the list of the ones I'm doing for next year. So I don't.
We need to add it, but
do a payroll one at one time. But also, even so, keep in mind that payroll is going to also be dependent on the state you're in, as far as what kind of laws there are.
Exactly. So here's our last question. If an employee is moving from one site to another, are we mandated to pay them for the time on the road?
Yes. If they start their day in one place, then that's commute. But if you have them move within their workday to another location, that's paid time and actually mileage.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's webinar presented by Heffernan. We will send information by email with instructions on how to access a copy of the presentation on our website. And thank you, CJ Westrick, for your time and expertise today. We hope all of the attendees found today's webinar to be a valuable use of your time. And be sure to join us on August 27th, a week from today, for disaster preparedness policies and drills. Thank you very much and have a safe day.